There are some stories that are so inspirational, they just don't fade over time. And for me, that is the story of the rise of Ayrton Senna. And this car tells that story. This is the 1982 Rolls from his first race at Thruxton before he went into the big time. Senna had been racing in go-karts since he was 4 years old in Brazil, came over to Europe. That's where he really showed his devastating form on the international scene, racing in Formula Ford, winning the category and then up to Formula Ford 2000, devastated the competition to win that championship. But Formula 3 was the launch pad to Formula 1. It still is. It's a widely recognised format and it's where the best drivers in the world congregate for the ultimate showdown. Senna had never raced F3 before. This is the first car that he tested on the 29th of October 1982 for Dick Bennett's of West Surrey Racing, and Dick is still racing today, 40 years on from Senna's victory in Formula 3 the year after. But this is the first taste he had of Formula 3 racing, and after that test he went to Thruxton for a non-championship round. The 1982 championship had been won by Tommy Byrne, and Senna came in for this extra round, basically borrowing one of Dick's cars. This is the car he borrowed, and in typical Senna fashion, stuck it on pole position in a sub 1:14, which only a few drivers had managed to do, led the race, scored fastest lap and won the round. And it was the perfect setup to take him into the 1983 season. These Formula 3 cars have always been a little bit smaller, a little bit slower than Formula 1. That's the whole point, is allowing talent to rise through and gain knowledge of different cars at different speeds until you get into the big league. That's where the tyres are a bit smaller, the cars are a bit narrower, the wings are a bit smaller, but these cars pack a punch and they have to be driven really with a lot of precision, commitment and aggression to make the most out of them. You have to carry momentum into the corner because there's not a lot of power. Only 165 brake horsepower from this 2-litre Toyota engine, strangled by an airbox that limits the amount of air going in to keep these things range bound and keep them underneath 180 brake horsepower. So 165 is a kind of limit they were looking for. And although the wings are quite small in these cars, this was the 1980s ground effect. So the car had these little skirts on the side, sucking it into the ground, and that was something that was policed really heavily in Formula 3. You couldn't run your car too low because you get a benefit in the amount of downforce that the car had. So very high grip, not very much power, and you can watch the driving style. These guys really pitch these cars in, very heavy on the steering to really load the car quickly, and it took a certain type of bravery to drive with that style. And of course, that was what Ayrton Senna was famous for. So that first race at Thruxton, it was a big deal. To come in straight out of nowhere and win your first Formula 3 race, that's no mean feat. But the difference was it was a non-championship round, which meant the main contenders from that series, including Martin Brundle, weren't present in that race, but they would be in 1983. And that's what Senna would be taking on in that following season, and no one really anticipated what a grand battle that would be. Just to help you out, when we're looking at the archive footage, 1982, Senna in the blue car. 1983, Senna in the white car. Brundle in the blue car. Now, for those of us who've watched Martin Brundle commentating on Formula 1, he looks like a very gentle man. He's a sort of good old boy from King's Lynn in Norfolk, but there's a hardness to Martin that not many people know about, and Senna was to discover when he was racing wheel to wheel with him. Senna went out in typical style. He was fast, he was on pole, he was first, he won a string of races. But Martin Brundle learned how to fight back and to lead with confidence, with Senna up his gearbox and occasionally driving over the top of him, trying to get past him in some of these last-ditch efforts, because Senna just couldn't believe that Martin Brundle had what it took to beat him. But Martin did have it. And despite the huge pressure that Senna would put on an opponent, Martin Brundle was able to win races against arguably the best driver of all time. In fact, going into the final round, Martin had a championship lead of 1 point. Senna was desperate to win the championship, and he literally pulled out all the stops. And I can show you one of the features of this Rolt 1982 car that's very similar, if not identical, to the 83 model, which is this radiator that's exposed. And there was a way to get extra performance and power out of the engine if you could get it to heat up quickly in the early laps. And the way to do that was to block off this radiator and restrict some of the cooling. Now that worked for the first 2 laps, but after that, if you didn't remove the tape, the engine would overheat and it would combust. So Senna had to loosen his belts at Thruxton. It's one of the fastest tracks in the world, very high speed, and there was only one place really he could do it, which was on the straight from Church to the chicane, and he had to undo the belts and get the tape off in time before he put the belts back on again, but there was a mistake. He couldn't get the belts on quickly enough and he had to take the chicane beltless with all the G-force throwing him around. Martin Brundle noticed him swerving all over the road as he was doing it, but he just about managed to get the belts done up again, win the race and win the championship, and then the rest is history. They went off to Macau for one additional non-championship round, which Senna won. He then got to get his Formula One dream drive. It was an incredible story. If you were racing in Formula 3 back in the day and your mirrors were full of Ayrton Senna, you knew that you would have to dig deep and produce perfect laps because Senna would punish any mistake. The gloves could come off at any moment. As Brundle discovered at Alton Park when Senna threw it up the inside in an impossible move. The cool thing with Senna though is the first thing he did when he got out of the car was to check that Martin was okay. These racing cars are real bare bones and people don't realise how lightweight they are, but with very little effort. It's just got no rolling resistance, and that's typical of West Surrey racing. They would have engineered out any resistance in this chassis of any kind and only weighs 455 kilograms. So although it's got fairly limited horsepower, the power to weight ratio is really good. But like I say, with the ground effect, you really had to commit to the corner, and you can see in the footage the way these guys heave the car in. It took a certain type to run at the front. Martin Brundle, Ayrton Senna, Tommy Byrne, Jonathan Palmer. Those were the kind of drivers that could really make the most of these chassis, and it's what separated the men from the boys. Modern Formula 3 cars, carbon fibre monocoque and lots of technology with a stressed engine and all that kind of stuff. You can see from this roll bar and the cage inside here that basically this is old school tech. The driver is basically sitting in the fuel tank. It's got a 5-speed gearbox with a dogleg first gear. And starting these cars, even today, Formula 3, you still start on the rev limiter and pull away. And it was no different then. With 165 brake horsepower, you haven't got that much power, and you've really got to try and slip the clutch to not stall the engine. So Formula 3 has always been a very high pressure game, but it's also where drivers really learn the precision of carrying those tiny amounts of speed. And at Thruxton, where this car had its win, it was really on point. Senna made the most of its performance. And you can actually also adjust this car whilst you're driving. So it's got adjustable rear roll bar. There's a little handle you can do that with. And for the front roll bar as well. It's a kind of engineer's nightmare thinking that the driver could be making these changes on the fly from inside the cockpit. But inside, it's really rudimentary, and you don't have things like the speedos, you don't need that kind of thing. It's all about the RPM gauge and seeing how many hundreds or 50 or 20 revs you manage to carry through a corner. You can see that carrying you down the straight, you know you're going faster. And the important gauge is obviously oil and water. But it's fundamentally a very basic car, not much different to a Formula Ford, but with slick tyres and wings to give you that really high speed cornering. Something that's still hotly debated to this day on forums and motorsport circles generally was Senna's unconventional driving style, the way he would stab at the throttle in the middle of a corner. Most people think, well, you'd stop the car, try and get a smooth trajectory and accelerate smoothly out, the Jackie Stewart style, if you like, and Senna would be hammering away at the throttle.
So the recap is the leader, Ayrton Senna da Silva.
Most people think that's because he raced in Formula 1 during the turbo era. We had to keep the turbos spooled up to get extra and instant power on the way out of the corner, but he also did it in naturally aspirated cars like this one and in go-karting. So what was he about?
And so for the last time through the hairpin, the Brazilian driver heading towards his 9th victory of the season, Ayrton Senna.
In Formula 3, momentum was critical. Once you lost speed in a corner, you just couldn't get it back. In a really powerful car, you can stop the car, you can V-shape the corner, blast off, and make the most of the horsepower. Formula 3, no. If you lost it, you couldn't get it back, and accelerating like that in the middle of the corner, you can get the rear to squat, you keep the speed up, but it does make the platform less stable. And that's something that Senna could deal with extremely well. And I've noticed it's quite a character trait with South American drivers, and occasionally try to mimic it myself. So it can work, but Senna was the maestro. This 1982 Rolt chassis, which is basically the same in every way to the 1983 model, really laid the foundation for Senna's record in Formula 3, and it was a record. Not just winning this first race, but also in the main championship in '83, winning 12 of 20 races. That's a 60% win record, which was unprecedented, and only beaten many years later by Jan Magnussen for Paul Stewart Racing. And that record didn't go unnoticed by the Formula One bosses. Senna was picked up by Toleman to race in Formula One in the 1984 season, winning on track his first race at the Monaco Grand Prix, being demoted afterwards by the stewards on a technicality. But on track, Senna was at the front and the king of the rain.
This is going to be the end of the Monaco Grand Prix with Alain Prost. And Prost is stopping, and Senna crosses the line before he gets there. Now that's amazing.
This exact car is pretty much all that remains of Senna's Formula 3 career, because the '83 car that he raced against Martin Brundle has pretty much vanished off the face of the earth. There's no trace of it. But this one has got a bit of extra history beyond Senna's hands. Another driver you may know called Gerhard Berger came across to England to buy it after Senna had raced and won at Thruxton. So Helmut Marko put the money down. Gerhard Berger travelled from Germany. He's going to compete with this in the European Series, and arrived at Dick Bennett's workshop to take this back to Europe on a flatbed trailer. And Dick Bennett said, no chance, you're not taking this car open air back to Germany. So he made him stay overnight whilst Dick arranged to get a tarpaulin and some tie wraps to basically cover and shield his crowning glory before he sent it across to Europe to get battered by the weather. Gerhard Berger competed in the 1983 season in that car and against Ayrton Senna when he came across for some of those Euro rounds in his new '83 Rolt. Senna did complain about the new car, saying that he preferred this one to the new one, but Dick Bennett always used to sell the old car to bring in the new and give his new drivers a new car. But Senna complained. He preferred the way this one handled, he liked this car, he was attached to it, and I guess was sad to see it go. So you do get familiar with these old hands and these old cars. You kind of get an ambience, you get used to them. This car's got a great provenance. It's going to be going off to America. It's its last day in the UK. I am just glad that I got to see it before it went. I just reminisce a little bit about the big inspiration behind my racing career, Ayrton Senna, the greatest of all time. Ayrton Senna was my childhood hero. Spending the day with his car has been really a special moment for me, and absorbing the ambience and the energy that's in this car, you just can't make it up. You have to see this thing in the flesh to believe it and really feel that emotion. So I hope you've enjoyed this as well, and I'll see you at the next one.